A lot to discuss. Let's greet our panel. From Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. Joining us from Toronto, Aurel Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Here in the studio, Harlan Ullman is a senior advisor for the Atlantic Council and the former advisor to the Kremlin and Russian analyst Alexander Nekrassov joins us from London. Welcome to all of you. Alexander, this will be Vladimir Putin's fourth term as president, altogether serving as both president and prime minister. He will have been at the top levels of Russian power for 25 years. Is that healthy for Russia to have one man holding the reins of power for so long?
Well, I think that the Russians are supporting Putin because they like to see a strong leader in Moscow. And it's a crucial matter for Russians because the election was more about the security of Russia rather than the economy because of the absolutely outrageous behavior of Western countries that are creating problems practically all over the world, anywhere you look. And I think what is a positive thing for Putin and the country as a whole, that this fascination of some people with the West and with the Western model of the economy is gone now completely. Nobody trusts this model, nobody trusts the West. All eyes are now looking in other directions. They're looking at China and other developing countries, at BRICS. And I think this is a good thing for Russia. And another good thing for Russia is that it did not develop the financial markets that are sucking the blood out of the Western economies and are basically existing in a virtual world of their own. The Russian markets are not strong and don't have that influence on the economy. So I suspect that the Russian economy will be slowly developing. There will be problems for Putin. There will be challenges. There will be challenges also in foreign policy, but I think he'll manage.
Aurel, what do you make of what Alexander said there, that it is essentially the behavior of the West, countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany and France, that have resulted in the election of Vladimir Putin for a fourth term? He is very popular in Russia, although his ratings did drop just before the election from 70 to 57%, but that is still very high.
Well, of course, you can have high ratings when you get to choose your opponents. And the problem is for Russia that if it looks for magic, a kind of political magical realism rather than realism, then it will not be able to deal with the problems that it is facing. And if Russia does not own up to the fact that it has agency, it is not just a victim, it is not just persecuted by other countries, that it somehow is an innocent party that had to invade Crimea, that had to involve itself into Syria, that had to make friends with rogue states like Iran and Venezuela, it is not going to succeed. And fantasy is not policy. And Russian foreign policy has been driven by a kind of cleverness, but cleverness is not a strategy. Russia needs to appreciate the fact that there are certain economic laws that if you have a unidimensional economy, you're not going to be internationally competitive. And look around the world. It's not that countries are not buying Russian cars because they are prejudiced against Russia. It's because Russia is not able to manufacture goods that the world wants. Russia relies 60% of its exports on energy. That tells you something about the massive failure of the economic system that is currently in place in Russia.
Pavel, what do you make of another 6 years of Vladimir Putin?
Well, first of all, I should say that Putin absolutely believes in market economy and in liberal economic reform. That has been the theme of his entire rule since the year 2000. And right now, Putin is forming a new reform government, a government that's going to, he intends to run a very radical reforms to, Putin is talking about a breakthrough of Russia catching up with the West, developing education, human capital, transforming its economy into a digital economy. And he's putting into high positions people who are part of the kind of liberal economic bloc with Mr. Anton Silanov becoming a financial czar, the only first deputy prime minister in the government, and also minister of finances at the same time. And Silanov was a deputy of Mr. Kudrin, who's going to be in the accounting office, and another former deputy of Mr. Kudrin, Tatiana Golikova, will be also deputy prime minister running social reform. And these reforms are going to be rather unpopular. It's going to be increasing of retirement age, cutting defense spending, cutting drastically the unruly Russian bureaucracy.
Right.
So this is a kind of cavalier charge into reforms.
Okay, Harlan, what do you make of it? There we hear that President Putin wants to modernize the Russian economy. He wants to bring in reformists to modernize that economy. Could this be a time when countries like the United States could actually try to reset relations again with Russia?
This is a tragedy of extraordinary proportions. The only thing the U.S. Congress will agree upon is that Russia is an enemy. This is not healthy. You have an American administration that, quite frankly, has not been able to sort out any kind of a policy. And you have in Mr. Putin a person who has been very, very clever in being able to divide the West, and he's done very well with that. What I've heard so far is a combination of Nikita Khrushchev, who said we will overtake you, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who imposed glasnost and perestroika on the Soviet Union, and look what happened. I think the notion of reform is essential, but history suggests this is going to be more than a rough road to hoe. The problem is that we face these huge differences between the West, the United States, NATO, and Russia, and we don't have any mechanisms to talk. Russia has withdrawn from the NATO-Russia Council, which is a huge mistake. The U.S. military has been prohibited, with a few exceptions, to talking to the Russians. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement and New START are in great jeopardy. And we have all these issues over Syria, in which there's no doubt that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. What's going to happen in North Korea? Nobody knows. And it seems to me the best thing that could happen would be for a lengthy summit between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, not just for a few days, but really for a long time. Remember, after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill came to Washington for a long time.
Yeah.
There's only, the two of them have got to meet for a long, long period to talk and to see where are there areas of agreement and where are there areas of disagreement. If not, I will guarantee you the situation will get worse in the West and worse in Russia.
Given this political climate domestically here in the United States, do you think that's possible?
Well, look what Trump has done.
Yeah.
He's now backing, he's made this argument, we have to have jobs for China with ZTE.
Right, right.
Mr. Trump, whatever his strengths or weaknesses, has the ability to do whatever he wants and get away with it. He could easily say, as he had, I'm going to meet President Kim, whether that meeting takes place or not. But Kim has gone from little rocket man to somebody I respect. Certainly with Putin, for whom the president seems to have some respect, there needs to be a lengthy summit to see where areas can be worked out, because we are on a collision course. Not that this means there's going to be a conflict, but it means that the Russians will continue to divide us. We will retaliate in some ways, and the situation for Russians and Westerners is going to deteriorate.
Alexander, what do you make of this? What are the major challenges that Vladimir Putin faces in this fourth term?
Well, the major challenges are complicated by the, as I said, the strange behavior of the West. Now, we hear a lot about, for example, aggressive Russia invading Crimea or supporting Bashar Assad, forgetting one thing, that the West has overthrown a legitimate regime in Ukraine before everything else started to happen. The West did absolutely nothing to resolve the situation in Syria until Russia interfered, and at least there is some hope now that there will be a solution. So the West needs to stop its propaganda, which brings nothing to the table. The West needs to understand something. It is no longer the progressive force. The only economy that is growing in the world with fast, rapid pace is the Chinese economy, the communist economy. All the other economies are sinking. Europe would be dead by now, the European Union, if they didn't pump about 80 billion euros every month into the financial markets.
Right.
They would be simply bankrupt already. America is pretending it is a reviving. It's not. The economy, the difference between the poor and the rich is getting absolutely astronomical, this gap. So for the West to continue blubbering about its liberal economics being the future. No way. Russia will not follow their path. Right. Their path leads into the abyss. So that's the important thing, that Putin knows this, by the way. Okay. And all these so-called liberal reforms, they will not be the reforms that the West wants to see.
Aurel, what do you make of the future of the relationship between Western countries and Russia? I mean, we've just heard that Putin wants to reform the Russian economy, wants to make domestic changes there, but at the same time, he wants to get the relationship with the West back on track. Is he going to be able to do that?
It's going to be very difficult, and it will be made doubly difficult if we accept this kind of notion, with due respect, of victimology in the case of Russia and demonization of the West. Russian reforms will have to come primarily from domestic sources. And all of these people who have come in, who may be well-intentioned, will not be able to succeed unless the reforms are fundamental, unless they deal with corruption, which is so corrosive in Russia that vast sums of money are going out of Russia and are being wasted. If there's no proper business law, if there's no reliability of an independent judiciary, all of that has to be done. And this comes up against the centrality of power, this kind of power vertical. And this is what has been very difficult to reconcile in Russia, that Mr. Putin insists on holding on to power in all sorts of areas, but a viable economy that is competitive means that he has to let go of that power. Yes, relations with the West, if they are improved, that would help. But that's not going to solve it by itself. So he has to move along multiple tracks. And I think there has to be an acknowledgement that Russia can do a lot in terms of reassurance, in ending provocations. They have managed to alienate countries that desperately want to have good relations with Russia, such as Sweden. Sweden has reintroduced conscription. It is increasing its military budget. It's worried about Russian subs and Russian aircraft. That is not a productive policy. That will not lead to improved relations.
Okay. Pavel, what do you make of that? Do countries like Sweden, other countries that have been friendly towards Russia, do they need to be concerned about Russian intentions?
Well, Sweden was never really very friendly to Russia. Russia and Sweden fought many, many wars, and in the end, Russia took away a lot of land from Sweden, and the Swedish military for 200 years were preparing for a final battle with Russia. So relations were never very good, and right now they're even much worse after the Swedes believe that Russia is threatening not them per se, but possibly the Baltics. States, and Sweden is ready to intervene. So that's a kind of, that's a bad example, because that's an example from both sides. Both nations are right now suspicious of each other very much. And that's a problem on many Russian borders. There's a lot of confrontation with different kind of powers, and a lot of it comes from internally. In Russia, there are different opinions. Russian government, the presidential administration are split. There are forces inside the Kremlin, inside the Russian government, basically pulling the country in totally different directions. And that also, of course, reflects on foreign policy.
Harlan, are there things that Western countries, especially members of NATO, should be doing to reassure the Russians that NATO intentions are not going to be threatening to Russia? For instance, that NATO will not be trying to recruit any more nations from what was the former Soviet bloc into the alliance?
No, I don't think that NATO has to do two things. One, its strategy, in my mind, is wrong. What we are doing is trying to confront what Russia is doing and blocking it with forces in kind. That's the wrong thing to do. What NATO needs is a really defensive strategy, what I call a porcupine strategy, that establishes a no man's land in which no military forces can operate. This is clearly defensive. NATO has not done that. NATO also has to deal with active measures, where the Russians have unfortunately been brilliant, or Mr. Putin has been brilliant, in terms of intimidation, in terms of cyber, in terms of propaganda, in terms of fake news. They've interfered, I think, quite effectively in America. They've interfered elsewhere in Europe, and we have done very, very little to block it. But most importantly, what NATO has to do, in my mind, is to have a discussion with Russia. I think further expansion of NATO is a non-starter. I was in disagreement with the expansion of NATO because we never, ever grappled with the question, what do you do with Russia? And I think what NATO has to do is really to move more towards some kind of a series of discussions. The conventional forces in Europe pact has now been abandoned. I talked about the nuclear pacts that are being abandoned. There has to be a means of reconciliation where we agree on areas where we have to do something, for example, in arms control, and maybe to de-escalate military exercises. But the fact of the matter is both sides, Europe, United States on one and Russia on the other, are seeing each other in more hostile views, and that is not going to be productive. The notion about victimology and who did what in the past that was wrong is nonsensical. We need to forget about that. It's very easy to accuse both sides of all sides of misdeeds. We are all fundamentally guilty. We have to look ahead, and somebody has got to take the first step. We have to get this relationship back on track, because the most profound problem that faces society, in my mind, is failed or failing government. We see it in Europe, we see this happening in the United States, and it's happening in Russia. And if Mr. Putin cannot reform, he may not be president for the full term that he's been elected.
Aurel, what do you make of that? Do you want to respond to that, the fact that both sides here are guilty?
Well, I like the idea of being forward-looking. I think that's very, very important. But what is missing in all of discussion is, again, a certain kind of realism. And the realism is that this is not a Cold War. Russia is not a superpower. We're not dealing with equals. Russia is not the equal of the United States. Russia is not the equal of China. And Russia is not the equal of the EU. And if anybody has a greater interest in resolving the problems, it is Russia. And let me get back to the fact that Russia has agency. Reassurance has to come from both sides. And you can't have that when there's this big celebration opening this bridge, Kerch, to Crimea, reinforcing the illegal conquest and annexation of Crimea, when you have continuing actions elsewhere, when Sweden, which I'm sorry to disagree with Pavel, tried, and I interviewed people in Sweden, tried to have very good relations with Russia in the past couple of decades. It's a left-wing government, and they managed to alienate that. I think they should send a message to the Kremlin. They're doing something very wrong.
Alexander, we just heard there, this is not a new Cold War, and Russia is not on the same level insofar as world power is concerned as the EU or as the United States or as China. That's reality.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the problem with the West is that it doesn't understand when it started moving NATO eastwards very rapidly, that was a bad mistake because a buffer zone was needed between Russia and the West neutral countries. Now Western forces are not only in the Baltics, which had never been threatened by Russia, by the way, but they are now in Ukraine. Until the Ukraine crisis is resolved and until Western troops get out of there, nothing will change, because Russia is now surrounded by NATO. NATO is talking about Russian aggression, and yet it is the one on the offensive. So this has to change. This propaganda has to change. As regards Russia being not as powerful as America and Europe, unfortunately for America and Europe, they are losing their power. Their economies are based on injections of huge newly printed or newly created electronic money. Their figures which they give on the economy are laughable. Excuse me, I did economics, and I laugh at the rates of inflation they're giving us, at the rates of unemployment. They're lying. They're showing to their people, all of that is to convince their own people that their economies are prospering. They're not. They have a terrible crisis, and the next financial crash is coming. They're just pretending that it's not there. So I think the point is, aggression has to stop. The West has to stop playing this double game. Oh, it's Russia, the aggressor, and at the same time committing all these aggressions against Russia.
Aurel, you know, we hear about all these differences between Russia and the West, but I'm wondering, you know, is there a lot of opportunity here as well for these two sides, for Western countries and Russia, to cooperate, things like terrorism, cybersecurity, climate change?
There are a lot of opportunities, and it is in the interest of both parties. If Russia were to introduce real market reforms and changes, Russia is a country that has unparalleled natural resources. It has an enormous amount of scientific talent. It should not be the poor country that it really is. but those changes would have to be fundamental. There's room for improving relations in the foreign policy area, in trade, in so many other areas. Both parties are responsible, but at this point, we have to again appreciate the fact that the onus in many ways is mainly on Russia. And just let me say something about NATO enlargement. NATO enlargement didn't come about because NATO was pushing for it. NATO enlargement came despite the reluctance of NATO to expand because countries that bordered on Russia feared Russia. They desperately wanted to get into NATO. And Russia has a job to reassure those countries.
But wasn't there a promise made to Gorbachev at the time when the Soviet Union disintegrated that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO, save for East Germany at that time, which would be reincorporated into a unified Germany?
It is an urban legend. Promises that are imagined or promises that are made off the cuff are not treaties. They're not binding. I would like to see the document that shows that there is a legal commitment, that there was a legal commitment not to expand. And I'm sure that Moscow would have produced that if that had ever existed.
Harlan, what do you make of that? You pointed out earlier on that there are things that the West needs to do as well, that NATO needs to do as well. There was that NATO summit which took place in Wales, in which that was the summit where they decided that they were
very depressing because it didn't achieve the things that it meant to. When you have 29 states and you have to have unanimity, it's very difficult to get anything done. I've been arguing for a long time NATO needs a different strategy. Unfortunately, you heard from London all sorts of interesting propaganda that was just factually wrong, but both sides are factually wrong about the other. We have to understand that there are a number of reasons why Russia did what it did. It opposed the invasion in Iraq in 2003 quite correctly. It resented the abrogation of the ABM treaty, and it thought that President Obama made a huge mistake when he drew red lines in Libya. We have made mistakes. The Russians have made mistakes. This nonsense about Crimea is just something that has got to be dealt with. I don't know that there's a solution, but having said that, Russia is now seen as the problem for the West. I think we've exaggerated that problem, but unfortunately there's no turning back. And so to repeat, there needs to be a major summit between the President of Russia and the United States, seeing if there are areas of agreement. Because if there are not, Russia is going to persist in its rearmaments. The United States is going to increase its nuclear power. We're spending a huge amount of money on defense. We're going to get engaged in a needless arms race. I don't know whether there are going to be flashpoints, but you take a look at what's happening in Yemen, you take a look at what's happening in the Middle East, in Syria, in Israel, and elsewhere. This may not be August 1914, but it is a very serious situation, and only serious people who look at serious solutions are going to be able to wend our way clear. And my judgment is that that's not going to happen, so the situation is going to continue to deteriorate for some time to come.
So what do you make of that, Pavel, the fact that there has to be fundamental changes on both sides?
Yes, well, the problem is that from the West, Russia is seen as something as a monolith, which it is not. I mean, if Washington is split, if Brussels is split, Moscow is also split. I mean, we have entrenched parties, groups of vested interest that have totally opposing views of how to move Russia in what direction and what to do and how to actually should be the relations with the West in the future. So just sitting down with Putin will not solve anything, because Putin is, of course, the supreme leader, but he is presiding over a totally split elite, where they're right now going into a very serious confrontation, because these reforms that are going to be right now pursued are going against the interest of many, many groups, including the general population, and the bureaucracy that should be reformed to stamp out corruption or contain corruption. But that will meet resistance from those who are corrupt. And defense spending should be cut, but that will meet resistance from the military, who are going to most likely provoke more confrontation with the West to explain why they need more money. So it can't be done like that. Russia is a complicated country, And before Russia has a clear understanding in which direction it's going to go, because right now it's not clear at all, it's very hard to begin to really build a comprehensive relationship.
Oman, can I profoundly disagree? Nixon met with Mao, Nixon met with Brezhnev. Don't tell me when two leaders get together they cannot change the world if they want. And the notion about bureaucracies and countries being divided, every country is divided. But unless you take the first step, those divisions are just going to get worse.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show. Or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.